We hear now Armchair Astronomy with members of the American Museum Hayden Planetarium staff talking to WBAI's David W. Teskey.
This is the 102nd in our continuing series of programs on astronomy. Contributing their time and knowledge to this venture are members of the American Museum Hayden Planetarium staff. The topic of today's discussion is William Herschel, the sixth of 6th Astronomical History Sessions. With us today is Astronomer Emeritus of the American Museum Hayden Planetarium, Mr. James S. Pickering. Here now is Mr. Pickering.
About the same time that Newton was living out the last of his life, over in Hanover, in Germany, there was a family, a man and his wife, Isaac Herschel and his wife Anna. And Isaac was a musician, an oboist in the band of the Hanover Guards, the Foot Guards, which were sort of a ceremonial troupe maintained by the Duke of Hanover there, one of the little principalities in Germany. And on November 15th in 1738, just 11 years after Newton died, they had a son, their third child, whom they christened Friedrich Wilhelm Herschel. He was brought up, they weren't wealthy people, but they were well off, they had a good home, and of course they had a tremendous diversity of interests. They were a thoughtful, close-knit family, and they did everything together and talked about everything and so on, and he was brought up in a very congenial home atmosphere. And, of course, following his father's footsteps, and all of the children, in fact, were brought up as musicians, studied music, had a liking for it, and learned either to play instruments or to sing. He had a sister, Carolyn, who looms large in his life, who had hopes of becoming a great singer. She had an excellent voice and was well trained. Friedrich Wilhelm himself learned to play the oboe and the violin when he was in his early teens. He too was part of the band of the Hanover Foot Guards. His education continued after he left the local grammar schools, whatever they amounted to in Hanover there, in the barracks school where the children of the soldiers were educated. He was educated further by a tutor, but he never went beyond that. Probably had the equivalent of a pretty good high school education. But he was an excellent musician. During the 7 Years' War, which was one of the wars started up by Frederick the Great at that time, this was in 1755, he wasn't yet 20, the Hanover Guards were sent to England to help man England against a possible French invasion and so on. And he was over there with the Guards for a while, but most of that time was spent in drills and parades and so forth. But he learned to like England. He went back, of course, the Guards went home, and he did get involved in one minor skirmish in which the band, contrary to custom and usage in those days, came under fire. And he took it pretty well and came out all right. His interest then was music, and he gave up the army. And on his own, with his older brother, Jacob, he returned to England to see if he couldn't make a living as a musician. And he got little jobs here and there. He taught music, gave music lessons. He composed a great deal of music, including, as he says, 7 symphonies. I've heard some of his music. It's not bad. It's very much like Haydn, who was at about that time, but there were little dances and so forth and so on, light pieces, but pleasant, but nothing world-shaking. I mean, nobody knows about Herschel's music now, and I don't think it would even if he had become greater in another field. And for about a year, he fiddled around. He tried to get a job as concert master of the town orchestra, or whatever it might be, in Edinburgh in Scotland, but failed in that, didn't get the job, I mean. And he lived a pretty precarious living there, from hand to mouth, and giving lessons and playing the oboe and the violin and writing these little pieces of music. But finally he got a good job. He was made organist, and this was in 1766, at the Octagonal Chapel in Bath. Now, Bath was the great social resort in England. Everybody went there. Everybody who was anybody went to Bath, and a lot of people who weren't anybody at all went there. Beau Nash, whose name became famous, was at one time the master of ceremonies at Bath. And of course, Bath was the baths, the therapeutic baths in England, natural warm springs and so on, and was surrounded by magnificent Georgian architecture and buildings and everything else. And the position of organist in the chapel there was a good one. And he stayed there for some years, had private pupils, and he prospered. So much so that he sent to Hanover for his younger brother Alexander and for his sister Caroline. Now, Caroline was the only girl in the family, and according to the custom of the time, she was Cinderella. I mean, she did all the work. She was the drudge. She washed the dishes and swept the floors and made the beds and put out the cat and did this and that and the other thing. And in order to persuade his family to let Caroline come over with his younger brother Alexander, and the three of them lived together, Herschel had to give his family enough money to pay the wages of a servant to take Caroline's place, which he was able to do and did. And he was there about 5 years at Bath, having apparently a very nice time, nice life, and leisure time. And he devoted some of this leisure time to a new hobby, which he had developed, which was astronomy. He got interested. I don't really know what triggered it, but he just suddenly became interested in the sky. Now, he tried to buy and to rent, as you could do and still can, telescopes, but none of them were good enough for his purposes. So he decided that he would make his own. He started in the basement of his home, similar to Newton's job, making this speculum metal, which is a combination of copper and tin. They had no knowledge yet of the putting reflective substances on glass to make mirrors. He had a couple of books which probably weren't too complete and thorough about how to do it, but he fumbled his way through it. Pretty near killed himself a couple of times by spilling hot metal all over the floor. And when the hot metal struck the cement floor, the whole place blew up, and so on. He had an awful time, but he persisted and got it done and had the tubes and mountings made by a local draftsman, or journeyman rather, after his drawings, and finally wound up with a very good telescope, about 6 inches diameter, reflecting telescope. And he used to take it out on the front lawn and observe, look through it. This was in 1778. He had a good telescope. He knew that. His gave beautiful, clean images and sharp definition, good resolution. It was fine. One night he was out there, and a man walked by and stopped and talked to him and asked if he might look through the telescope. And Herschel, of course, said, "Sure, be my guest." And the man did, and knew enough to be amazed at the excellence in quality of the telescope and the images it produced. Now, the man happened to be a Dr. William Watson, who was a big shot in the Royal Society, and who immediately took fire at Herschel's obvious ability. He said, "Where'd you get your telescope?" "I made it," one of those deals, and began to get interested in it. It took a long time. In the meantime, Herschel was an avid observer. He was out every clear night, and little sister Caroline was out with him, helping him. Herschel began with, I suppose you might call, traditional Teutonic telescopic exploration of the skies. In other words, he would just sweep across the sky, noting down the appearance, the brightness, the position, everything else about everything he saw. And little Caroline would, at his dictation, sit there in a notebook behind him so the light wouldn't get in his eyes, probably with a candle or a lamp of some kind, and put down all this business that Herschel was dictating to her. He explored the whole sky. And during this exploration, on the 13th of March in 1781, he found something which was not a star. It didn't look like a star. Now, stars give sharp, explosive points of light in a telescope. They look just the same as they do to the eye on any clear night, but of course through a telescope you can see many, many more of them than you can with your eyes. But this was a little greenish disk. It didn't have the oomph of a star, and it was slightly greenish in color. Immediately, Herschel suspected that he had found a comet, which was not unusual. So he went out the next night and for several nights and measured its position, because he knew that if it were a comet, it would move. Well, it moved. It was not stable as the stars were, not definitely fixed. And he reported it. He sent a letter to the astronomer at Oxford, and he also wrote to his friend Dr. Watson, telling about what he had found. Well, I don't know what the astronomer at Oxford did, if anything, but Watson went to work and trotted right up to the Astronomer Royal of that time, who was Sir Neville Maskelyne, a very famous man. And Maskelyne got interested right away and confirmed the discovery and said, "No, this is not a comet. It can't be anything else but another planet." And that's what it was, the planet Uranus, the first discovered planet. All the other planets had been known since time immemorial because you could see them with your eyes alone. But this one was not, and it was by pure chance that he found it, you see, just in his systematic exploration of the sky. Twice as far away from the sun as Saturn is, he doubled the size of the known solar system with this discovery. That made him. Publicity that was given to his discovery by William Watson's efforts. This chance passerby who took a liking to him and was interested, he was given credit for it and made Fellows of the Royal Society and all other kinds of honors, which he richly deserved. I mean, this was coming to him. He wanted to call the new planet Georgium Sidus, George's star, after King George III, but that was not a good idea. I mean, George III was not particularly popular, and all the other planets had Latin names or Greek names. So finally, a German astronomer, Johann Elert Bode, who was editor of the great Astronomische Nachrichten, suggested the name Uranus, who was the ancient Greek god of all the heavens for the planet, and that's what it was called. Watson felt that he was wasting his time playing the organ and being a musician. And in order to make it possible for him to devote at least more of his time to astronomy, Watson went to the king and got Herschel a pension to live on. He made telescopes, made the best telescopes that anybody had ever heard of, reflecting telescopes. He sold 10 of them, in fact, to King George. What he wanted with 10, I don't know, but he bought 10 of them. And Herschel moved with Caroline and his brother to a little cottage out near Windsor so that he could be near the king. And I suppose George would bumble over every once in a while and sit around and say, oh, and ah, and they probably had good times together, looking at the skies through Herschel's telescope. And I imagine Herschel, most of the time, wanted very much to have George go home and get out of his way so that he could get on with his work. But he did build a whole series of telescopes. Finally, he tried to build one with a mirror 48 inches across, 4-foot reflector. Didn't succeed. It wasn't successful. But he had the great big tube of this thing, which was probably a good 6 feet in diameter. Later on, when he finally moved to the place where he lived for most of his life, which was a place called Slough, I think you'd pronounce it, S-L-O-G-H-O-U-G-H in England, this tube, this great telescope tube, lay in the backyard of his home in Slough for many, 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 many years. And Herschel was a friendly sort of a guy, still loved music, still used to play. Friends come in, and almost invariably when there was a gathering at his house, they'd all go out and get in this tube and sing and get the echoes, you know, it's like singing in the bathtub and so on. They had a wonderful time. But the best telescope he made, and the one with which he did most of the work, was one which had an 18-inch reflector. Now, that's a big telescope. He devised a new optical system, a different optical system. You remember when we spoke about Newton, how Newton had put a little secondary mirror at an angle of 45 degrees up in the top of the tube, just short of the focal length of the primary mirror, so that the focus was directed outside through a hole in the tube and examined by an eyepiece. Well, Herschel didn't do that. He tipped his whole mirror a little bit off level, the bottom of the tube, and fixed his eyepieces to the edge of the top of the tube, you see, and tipped the mirror just so the focus hit the edge of the tube. And you could stand with your back to whatever you were looking at, and sort of, it was as though you were peering over the edge of the thing, but actually the final eyepiece arrangement was fastened up to the top edge of the tube. The Herschelian system, it doesn't adapt itself at all to the use of any auxiliary instruments or anything like that, and it's never been widely used. But Herschel invented it and used it and was quite successful with it. But of course, all he ever did was to look through the thing. There were no cameras in his day, and he was an eye man entirely. He went to work. Up until Herschel's time, the stars were nothing. Forget them. They were just background, just markers for the motions of the planets and everything else. But with Herschel, the stars began to come into their own. Herschel went on the assumption, just as a theory, that all stars were equally bright, and that those which were fainter simply because they were far away. And he began to investigate this, and he had the feeling that there was some kind of a system to the whole deal, which I I guess every astronomer must have that driving feeling behind him if he's going to get anywhere. You've got to find out what is going on and why. Well, Herschel made, you remember we spoke about the methodical exploration of the skies that he was making when he discovered Uranus. Well, he made 5 such explorations of the sky with various telescopes, as his telescopes have proved, in which, as I say, mostly to little Sister Caroline, who was at his elbow all the time, noting down, taking down all this stuff. He made 5 such telescopic trips through the sky, and I mean literally everything in the sky was looked at and described and located and measured and everything else. He made innumerable discoveries, double stars. Nobody paid any attention to them. Herschel began to pick up what he thought were double stars. He didn't know, in most cases, whether they were actually gravitationally connected or whether they were just in line, one beyond the other, or what. But that was a great interest of his. And in looking over the sky, he began to find little things up there, little fluffy clouds, little spotty, fuzzy things, which were obviously not stars. These were nebulae. 50 years before Herschel was born, a French astronomer by the name of Charles Messier, who was working at a hack job in Paris at the observatory just about the time of the French Revolution, measuring tides in the Seine and probably sweeping out the observatory, doing things like that, had a feeling that he wanted to become rich and famous, and he figured that the only way he could become rich and famous was to discover comets. So Messier became an avid comet hunter. In fact, the current Louis, whoever he may have been, I forget his number then, called him the ferret of comets. Messier would observe and explore the sky and look for comets, and every once in a while he'd bump into one of these little blobs of gas or something like that, which looked superficially like comets, enough so that he'd have to drop everything and go and run to his charts and see if there was anything up there. So that finally, and how much of this is apocryphal and true or not, I don't know, he finally started to make a list of these little foolers, these nuisances that were up there, so that all he had to do was refer to his list and, oh yes, I've seen that before, that isn't a comet. Ironically enough, although Messier did discover 15 comets, nobody knows that. What he is famous for is the first catalog of stars, clusters, and nebulae. Messier's list. Every object on that list has a number preceded by the letter M. And if you hear people talk about M31 or M1 or M10 or something like that, it is a list from this original catalog of Messier's. And through Messier's own observations and contributions of others, it finally wound up as a list of 104 objects, M104, 2 of which are no longer there and must have been comets, which he put in this object but didn't realize that he'd trapped his quarry and wasn't aware of it. Herschel went to work on Messier's list, which is a very common experience with many amateur astronomers. It's a good thing to do. I mean, find these things yourself and look at them. While Herschel was doing that, he found thousands more that Messier had either overlooked, probably hadn't been able to see with his less sufficient equipment. Herschel's telescope was good, probably the best in the world at that time. But these little nebulae began to turn up in crowds in Herschel's records. And he noticed a large percentage of them had a strange similarity of form. He could see them obviously at all angles. Some of them were face on, and they looked like coils wound up, and he called them spiral nebulae. Little clouds of glowing gas, he thought, which were up there, all more or less alike. That was one project. Another one was that what was the shape of the universe, provided, of course, the stars had anything to do with the shape of the universe. So he made a systematic star count. He would take an area of a given number of square degrees in one part of the sky and count all the stars in it. Then he would take an area equal in size in a different part of the sky and count those and gradually work toward the Milky Way. And of course, when he got into the Milky Way, there was no counting the stars in an area of that size compared to the stars far to one side or the other of it. And he began to see that there was a picture there, a thing, something, a great organization of stars and these little funny little nebulae and spiral nebulae and so on. And he made the first attempt at getting the shape of what he called the universe, which we now know is the shape of our own local galaxy. And it came out pretty well. He had a sort of a wheel of stars, rather flat, not really spherical, with two long arms off at one end of it, and said the sun was probably in the middle of this thing. It was flat, and when we looked through the stars in this wheel, we saw the Milky Way. When we looked at the top or the bottom of it, where there weren't so many stars, we could see the scattered stars in other parts of the sky. In a sense, that is what we feel now. And when we see the Milky Way, we're looking toward the edge of our galaxy along its greatest dimension. When we look out the flat sides of it, we see scattered stars and no Milky Way. But Herschel's was the first conception of that. His catalog of nebulae of various kinds, the spiral nebulae and what he called the diffuse nebulae. He had a very complicated system of organizing these. He gave them Roman numerals in a certain class. Class 1 were clusters, class 2 were something else, 3, 4, 5. He had about 7 different classes of clusters and nebulae. Clusters of stars, globular clusters, open clusters. And also he found a great number of circular-looking nebulae, which were not spiral nebulae, but which had little markings in them that he was able to see, and he named them planetary nebulae, not because they had anything to do with planets, but because they roughly look like planets, little disks, you see. And these planetary nebulae are still so called. He was the one that named them, the Ring Nebula in Lyra, the Crab Nebula, the Owl, the Dumbbell, and so on. There are a couple hundred of them, I guess, known now, probably more. But that class of nebula, whose source we are not yet sure of by any means, they usually surround a very, very hot central star whose radiation excites the cloud of gas around them into brilliance, but where the cloud came from, it probably came from the star, but just how and so forth, we're not sure of yet. Something to do maybe with a recurrent nova or a slow leak of stuff out of the star or whatever. But in any event, that was one of Herschel's christenings. The very accurate measurements he was able to get with this telescope, this big 20-footer, it was quite a piece of work. He had it mounted in, did you ever play jack straws? You know, where you pick up a stick without upsetting? Well, he had a thing, I don't know what you'd call it, not really the mounting, but the arrangement in which his telescope was set. It looks to me always, I've seen drawings of it, like a pile of jack straws. It's all beams here and there setting on a great round table. And he had a crew of about 20 men to pull and haul the thing around, you know, while he was working up there, and little Caroline was still within earshot so that you could hear and note down what he was doing and saying and finding out. He was Mr. Astronomy for about 50 years. There was nobody to touch him. He was the top man, totally without pretense, totally without arrogance, just a nice, good-hearted, gemütlich German fella who taught himself and knew the sky, knew everything. But the stars were the thing. The planets, he discovered the new one, yes, of course, but that was the last contact he had with the planets. The heck with them. I mean, it was the stars and the big picture that he was after. And this is the first time it's happened, you see. Nobody gave a hoot about the stars before. But Herschel began to think about them. Think about these little spiral nebulae up there. What were they? What was it all about? He also found out another very interesting thing. In his meticulous observation of the sky, he noticed that certain stars in a certain rather restricted area of the sky had a motion all away from each other, which could not be accounted for by the proper motion of the stars, which he had also enlarged upon and measured very carefully. And he decided that the reason for this, that this was not a real motion on the part of all these stars, it was an apparent motion due to perspective, because the sun and its attendant planets were traveling in that direction, do you see, through space, toward these stars, making them open out as you go. If you approach a grove of trees, when you're a mile away, they're thick and close together, and from where you are, you can't get through them. But as you walk toward them, they open out, and you have no problem. You go right through, do you see? Well, that's what happened here. And he called it the apex of the sun's way, which I think is a beautiful name. That's the direction toward which the sun is going. It's up in the very eastern edge of the constellation of Hercules, not too far from the very bright star Vega in Lyra. And Herschel's first estimate of the location of this has not been changed too much. Other astronomers with better instruments and so on have put it a few degrees here and a few degrees there to one side, but it's in that neighborhood. And to confirm that, later on, his son, John Herschel, who was also a tremendous astronomer, went down to Africa to observe the southern skies, which were not available from England, and found the antipex of the sun's way, or the part of the sky from which the sun is moving, you see, and in which the stars are pulling together because of perspective. They're opening out as you go toward them and closing in as you leave them, you see, which is in the constellation of Columba, the dove down there in the southern skies. And there's no question about it that that's what it was. It was the effect of the motion of the sun and the earth carried along by the sun on the sky. Well, Herschel got married. He had a son, John, and married a very lovely woman by the name of Mary Pitt, who fell also in love with Caroline and treated her as a sister. And poor Caroline didn't know how she was going to get along. She had a bad time when Herschel fell in love, got married. She thought she'd be tossed out, but no. She was made most welcome into the family by Mary Pitt, who was then, of course, the official hostess and so on. And their work went on and on and on. He was the world's great astronomer. Didn't have any particular competition for a long time. He was knighted Sir William. He anglicized his name, Frederick William instead of Friedrich Wilhelm. He was Sir William Herschel. He was the first president of the Royal Astronomical Society, which was founded during the height of his career. And I have read books which were published during Herschel's life and shortly after he died, in which he's the only astronomer mentioned. I mean, the whole story of the universe and the sky and everything else is Herschel, what he says. And he's not too far wrong for those days either. He was not at all wild. He saw everything he said he saw, and he made pretty good judgments of it. Of course, he had no idea that these little spiral nebulae that he was looking at were exterior galaxies. In fact, nobody knew that until 1923. It's that recent that we realized that our galaxy is not our view of the whole universe, but we're just one little piddling galaxy in among billions more of about the same size, and that the universe is unimaginably large. But Herschel laid out the foundation for this, gave the first hints of this thing and of the complexity of the universe and the stars in it and their arrangement and distribution and the way they work and all the rest of it. And he finally died at 84. He lived to a ripe old age in 1822. Sister Caroline, then, who had spent her whole life with him, never got married and anything else, was devoted to him and had been his perpetual unpaid amanuensis, unpaid in the sense that she lived very well with him and was a valued member of his family and accepted by his wife and all the rest of it. She went back to Hanover then to spend her declining years, and while she was there, edited the great catalog of Herschel's discoveries. I mean, as I say, he found well over 2,500 nebulae, clusters, and things which were not single stars, had a wealth of information about individual stars themselves and all of these things. It was a massive work for which she was given great honors and medals and so on. And little Caroline died in 1848, just a few days before her 98th birthday. They were a long-lived family. Of course, the work that Herschel did is the foundation for present astronomy. It was not until 1923 or 4 that we realized that these little spiral nebulae of Herschel's were exterior galaxies, as I said. And what has come after that, of course, is refinement of Herschel's great discoveries. He didn't know, and nobody knew until 150 years later what these things were that he was looking at. But he laid the foundation for modern stellar astronomy. And of course, as observational techniques improved and as instruments improved, the work went on and expanded.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pickering. We have been listening to Astronomer Emeritus of the American Museum Hayden Planetarium, Mr. James S. Pickering, discussing William Herschel, the concluding session in our 6th Astronomical History programs. We hope you will be with us next week, and if you have any topics or questions you'd like discussed on future programs, indicate them by card or letter to Armchair Astronomy, WBAI, 30 East 39th Street, New York, 16, New York. We will try to answer as many questions as possible in future programs. Until next week, good day.
This has been Armchair Astronomy with members of the American Museum Hayden Planetarium staff talking to WBAI's David W. Teskey.
We hear now the complete history of astronomy from Thales through William Herschel. Mr. James S. Pickering, astronomer emeritus of the American Museum Hayden Planetarium, who has written numerous books on astronomy, including The Stars Are Yours, 1001 Questions Answered About Astronomy, and his most recent book, Asterisks, a book of footnotes of astronomical anecdotes. Mr. Pickering is also the editor of the Astronomical section of the World Almanac. The sections of the 3-hour astronomy history program is Thales through Ptolemy, Copernicus and Tycho Brahe, Galileo, Johann Kepler, Isaac Newton, and William Herschel. Here now is Mr. Pickering.
It's a far cry, of course, from the first conceptions of the classic antique astronomers, Aristotle and Ptolemy and those, where the Earth was the center of the universe, little cramped, complicated universe trying to justify and account for the various motions, which of course the better known they were, them became more complex, and follow that thread up through Ptolemy, who, like Herschel, was Mr. Astronomy, but for a longer time, simply because there was no competition. But Ptolemy's system was the system for 1,500 years, until Copernicus came along and began to think for himself and to find out that the simplest way was the best way, and that the Earth was finally another planet, belonged to the great family of the Sun. And you have Tycho, of course, who was the first really scientific observer, but still without a telescope, observing the positions of these things, watching them as they moved through the sky, seeing where they were, not only at a few nights in a year, but hour after hour, night after night, so that he could outline the complete picture. It's like these puzzles, where you draw a line from one dot to the other. Well, Tycho put in the missing dots, do you see, and made the lines easier to draw and easier to see. And then, of course, you have Kepler, who took these little dots that Tycho had drawn and drew the picture and produced the formula, not the reason, but the formula said the planets are moving not in circles, which was a blow to everybody, but in ellipses, that they move more rapidly when they are nearer to the sun than when they are farther away, which is a rough translation of the radius vector sweeps out equal areas in equal times, and that the distance of the planets from the sun has a direct relation to their velocity, and that is the length of time it takes them to move around the sun. The mass factor, of course, is in there. Herschel knew that, but he also knew that the mass of the sun was so overwhelmingly greater than the mass of the planets that you can disregard it in this special case. But why? Well, some time went by before we knew why, but then came Galileo, who opened up the new frontier with telescopes, began to see things not as the eye saw them, but as they were, made, of course, the innumerable discoveries which anyone who had the first telescope would have made. Galileo did it, and did it beautifully. Nobody could have done it better than he. And then we have, of course, Newton, who put the whole thing together. And, of course, Newton's laws, the great laws of motion, the law of universal gravitation, have had to undergo certain modifications as we began to understand the system better. Einstein has prefaced his little expose of some of the weaknesses with the words, "Newton, forgive me," but there is no object at rest in the universe. There are no straight lines in the universe, so that when you say every object in the universe remains either in a state of rest or uniform motion in a straight line, and that's acted upon by some outward force, you're talking about things that don't exist, you see. That's just one of the tenets. To me, it's a kind of a quibble, but still, don't throw Newton away. I mean, you can get along very nicely on most of Newton's laws, and the law of universal gravitation is still good. Everybody in the universe attracts every other body in the universe with a force which is directly proportional to the mass of the bodies and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. That's it. That's good. That holds. This is the foundation. Then we come to Herschel, in which the stars came into their kingdom. The planets ruled the roost before that. Now, here are the stars, and here is the universe, and from there is the foundation. These great ages, from before Ptolemy, the big men there, all the people in between, capped by Herschel, and now on that foundation is built the modern science of astronomy, and who knows where it's going to end. We go on from here.
We have been listening to The Complete History of Astronomy from Thales through William Herschel, told by Mr. James S. Pickering, Astronomer Emeritus of the American Museum Hayden Planetarium.